No one is ever going to want you again. 5 words. That was all it took to follow Claire Bennett for the next 6 years of her life. The words lingered longer than the marriage, longer than the divorce papers, longer than the silence that settled between two people who once promised forever beneath the warm glow of a summer sunset in Cape Cod. And on a chilly October evening in New York City, as crystal chandeliers scattered golden light across a ballroom filled with entrepreneurs, investors, and media executives, those words echoed in Claire's mind once more. The Grand Regent Hotel buzzed with quiet confidence. Men in tailored suits exchanged handshakes worth millions. Women in elegant gowns moved through the crowd with effortless grace. Waiters balanced silver trays carrying sparkling water and champagne beneath towering floral arrangements. On the massive digital screens surrounding the stage, a countdown slowly ticked toward the evening's most anticipated announcement. Claire stood near the back of the ballroom, her sapphire blue gown simple compared to many others in attendance. She preferred it that way. Attention had never been her goal. Not anymore. The scent of fresh orchids drifted through the room as she adjusted the silver bracelet on her wrist. Her fingers trembled slightly. Not from fear. Not exactly. It was something else. Something deeper. The strange sensation of standing on the edge of a moment that could change everything. Across the room, Ethan Walker laughed at something his fiancée had just said. The sound carried farther than it should have. Claire hadn't heard that laugh in years, yet she recognized it instantly. Some sounds become permanent residents inside memory. Ethan looked older now. The sharp confidence remained, but time had softened the edges. A few silver strands touched his dark hair. Fine lines framed the corners of his eyes. Success still wrapped around him like a custom-made suit. He was a partner at one of Manhattan's most respected law firms. People still gravitated toward him. People still listened when he spoke. And yet tonight, for reasons he couldn't explain, he felt strangely unsettled. His eyes scanned the ballroom absent-mindedly until they landed on a familiar face. The smile disappeared. For a moment, he simply stared. Claire. The name struck him like a forgotten melody. He hadn't expected to see her here. Not at an event like this. Not among founders, executives, and industry leaders. 6 years ago, when their marriage ended, he had believed he understood exactly how her story would unfold. Claire had always been quiet, supportive, content to stand beside someone else's spotlight. During their marriage, she remembered every birthday, every client dinner, every holiday gathering. She built the life around Ethan's ambitions while quietly setting aside her own. She had dreams once. She remembered that now. Dreams of creating educational programs that could help students from small towns access opportunities usually reserved for the privileged. But dreams required time, energy, resources. Marriage had demanded all three. Then came the divorce. Looking back, Claire often struggled to identify the exact moment everything broke. Maybe it was the endless criticism disguised as advice. Maybe it was the subtle reminders that she wasn't ambitious enough, smart enough, interesting enough. Or maybe it was the night Ethan stood in their modern penthouse apartment overlooking the Hudson River and delivered the sentence that would haunt her for years. She could still see it perfectly. Rain streaking the floor-to-ceiling windows. The city lights blurred beyond the glass. The silence between them heavier than any argument. Ethan stood near the kitchen island, loosening his tie after another 14-hour workday. Claire had just told him she wanted to pursue an educational technology idea she'd been developing quietly for months. She expected skepticism, questions, maybe concern. Instead, she received laughter. Not cruel laughter. Somehow that made it worse. Dismissive laughter. The kind reserved for impossible ideas. Claire, he had said, shaking his head. You don't understand how the real world works. The conversation spiraled from there. Old frustrations surfaced. Resentments neither of them had fully acknowledged. And eventually, as if searching for the final blow that would end the discussion forever, Ethan delivered the sentence. No one is ever going to want you again. The room had gone silent. Even the rain seemed quieter afterward. Claire remembered staring at him, waiting for regret to appear on his face. It never did. At least not then. She remembered the strange calm that followed. Not anger. Not tears. Just emptiness. Like watching a door close somewhere deep inside herself. 3 weeks later, she left with 2 suitcases and a bank account that suddenly felt very small. Tonight, Standing inside one of New York's most prestigious events, she thought about that younger version of herself. The woman who walked away believing she had failed. The woman who spent months measuring her worth through the lens of someone else's disappointment. The woman who didn't yet know that sometimes the end of one story becomes the first page of another. On the giant screen above the stage, the countdown reached 60 seconds. Conversations softened. Guests gradually turned toward the front of the room. Excitement spread through the audience. Ethan glanced toward the stage before looking back at Claire. Something felt wrong. Or perhaps not wrong. Unfamiliar. Because the woman standing across the ballroom no longer carried the quiet uncertainty he remembered. She stood differently now. Shoulders relaxed. Chin slightly raised. Comfortable in her own presence. Whatever had happened during those missing years, it had changed her. The lights dimmed. The countdown continued. 59. 58. 57. Claire took a slow breath and watched the numbers fall. Somewhere in the distance, beyond the music and conversation, beyond the glow of chandeliers and camera flashes, she could almost hear that old sentence again. No one is ever going to want you again. A faint smile touched her lips. Because Ethan had no idea that the woman he once underestimated was about to become the most important person in the room. 6 years earlier, there had been nothing glamorous about Claire Bennett's new beginning. No triumphant music. No inspirational speeches. No hidden fortune waiting to be discovered. There was only a fifth-floor walk-up apartment in Brooklyn, 2 mismatched chairs purchased from a thrift store, and a refrigerator that hummed louder than the traffic outside her window. The first night she moved in, she sat cross-legged on the hardwood floor surrounded by unopened boxes and listened to the city breathe through the thin walls. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked. A subway train rattled beneath the streets. Someone laughed in an apartment she would never see. For the first time in years, there was no schedule to manage except her own. No networking dinners. No corporate events. No expectations. Yet freedom felt strangely similar to loneliness. Claire wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and stared at the cracked ceiling. The silence felt enormous. The divorce settlement had covered basic expenses, but not much more. Ethan's attorneys had been efficient. Everything had been clean, professional, and devastatingly final. Within 3 months, Claire realized that surviving would require more than optimism. It would require reinvention. During the day, she worked wherever she could. She answered customer service calls for a software company. She organized inventory for a local bookstore on weekends. She tutored middle school students in math during evenings. Every dollar mattered. Every shift mattered. She learned to calculate grocery costs down to the cent. She stopped ordering coffee and started making it at home. She repaired worn shoes instead of replacing them. Some nights exhaustion settled into her bones so deeply that she fell asleep with her laptop still open beside her. Yet despite everything, one small idea refused to disappear. It followed her through subway rides and sleepless nights. It waited quietly in the back of her mind while she scanned bookshelves or answered customer complaints. The idea was simple. Too simple, many people would later tell her. Claire believed educational opportunities should not depend entirely on zip codes. She had spent years volunteering with students from underfunded communities. She knew how many talented young people lacked access to mentorship, career guidance, and practical learning resources. She believed technology could help bridge that gap. So every night after work, she began building something. At first, it was only sketches in a notebook. Flowcharts, lesson plans, user experience ideas. Eventually, those sketches became presentations. The presentations became prototypes. The prototypes became a tiny software platform that barely functioned but carried the outline of a vision. Most people dismissed it immediately. Investors smiled politely before declining meetings. Others listened for 10 minutes before suggesting she pursue something more realistic. One venture capitalist in Manhattan spent nearly 30 minutes explaining why the education sector was not attractive enough. Another advised her to find a more experienced founder and join their team instead. Claire thanked them all. Then she went home and kept working. Winter became spring. Spring became summer. The city continued moving around her while she quietly built something few people believed in. There were moments she almost quit. Moments when unpaid bills stacked higher than her confidence. Moments when rejection felt personal. On one particularly difficult afternoon, after receiving her 23rd investor rejection, Claire sat alone on a park bench overlooking the East River. The sky was gray. Wind rippled across the water. She remembered Ethan's voice more clearly than she wanted to. Not the argument, not the divorce, just the certainty behind his words. For a few minutes, she wondered if he had been right. Maybe she had mistaken determination for capability. Maybe ambition arrived too late. Maybe some people simply were not built for extraordinary things. Then her phone buzzed. A message from one of her tutoring students appeared on the screen. A 15-year-old girl named Madison. "Thank you for helping me believe I could get into engineering school. I got accepted today." Claire read the message 3 times. Then she smiled. Not because the message solved her problems. It did not. But because it reminded her why she started. The next morning she returned to work. 2 years later, everything began changing faster than she could process. A nonprofit organization agreed to pilot her platform in 6 school districts. Student engagement numbers exceeded expectations. Teachers recommended it to colleagues. Word spread. More districts signed contracts. Then more. For the first time, revenue appeared. Not enough to celebrate, but enough to breathe. Claire hired her first employee, then her second. They rented a modest office space above a bakery in Queens. The scent of fresh bread drifted through the floorboards every morning. The furniture was inexpensive. The conference room doubled as a storage area. Nobody cared. They were building something real. 3 years after leaving her marriage, Claire's company served more than 50,000 students nationwide. For years later, national education conferences invited her to speak. 5 years later, major investors began requesting meetings she once begged to receive. Yet the strangest part was not the success. It was how little she thought about Ethan anymore. Somewhere along the way, his opinion had lost its authority. Not through anger, not through revenge, simply through distance. The life she was creating required too much focus to leave room for old ghosts. Then one rainy Tuesday morning, while Claire reviewed quarterly reports from her corner office overlooking Midtown Manhattan, her assistant appeared at the door carrying a small envelope. There was no company logo, no explanation, just her name written neatly across the front. Curious, Claire opened it. Inside was a business card. Elegant, minimalist, expensive. Beneath the name was a publication recognized in nearly every corner of the business world. Claire stared at the card. Then she read it again. And for the first time in years, her heart skipped a beat. The card remained on Claire's desk long after sunset. Outside her office windows, Midtown Manhattan shimmered beneath thousands of lights. Yellow taxis crawled through intersections like streams of gold. Office towers glowed against the darkening sky. Yet Claire barely noticed any of it. Her attention remained fixed on the small white card resting beside her laptop. The name printed across the front belonged to one of Forbes magazine's senior editors. At first she assumed there had been some mistake. Perhaps they wanted a quote about education technology. Perhaps they were researching a broader industry story. Surely they were not interested in her. Not really. But 3 days later, she found herself seated inside a quiet conference room overlooking Bryant Park while 2 reporters and a photographer asked questions she never imagined hearing. They wanted to know about her childhood, her setbacks, her leadership philosophy, the first failed version of her platform, the moments she almost gave up. Claire answered honestly. She spoke about sleeping 4 hours a night while juggling multiple jobs. She spoke about rejection letters and empty bank accounts. She spoke about students whose lives changed after receiving opportunities they never expected. What she did not mention was Ethan. Not because she was protecting him, because he was no longer relevant to the story. For years she had believed he occupied a central chapter of her life. Sitting there now, she realized he had merely been a turning point. Nothing more. Weeks passed, then months. Business continued growing. New partnerships emerged. Additional school districts signed contracts. Claire became accustomed to interviews, conferences, and media requests. The Forbes conversation gradually faded into the background, until one Monday morning when her phone began vibrating nonstop before sunrise. Messages flooded her screen. Congratulations. Proud of you. You deserve this. Have you seen it yet? Confused, Claire sat up in bed and opened the first link. For several seconds, she simply stared. There she was. Her photograph filled the screen. Beneath it appeared a headline introducing her as one of the most influential entrepreneurs reshaping educational access across America. She read the article twice, then a third time. The words felt unreal. Not because they exaggerated her achievements, because they described a woman she was still learning to recognize. A woman who no longer viewed herself through the lens of failure. Across the country, thousands of people shared the story. Investors called. Educators reached out. Former classmates sent messages she had not expected to receive. Yet among all the congratulations, one message never arrived. Ethan Walker said nothing, at least not publicly. In truth, Ethan saw the article within hours of publication. He was seated in a conference room preparing for a client presentation when a colleague placed a magazine on the table. "Have you met her before?" the colleague asked casually. Ethan looked down. The world seemed to pause. Claire's face stared back at him from the cover. Confident, poised, completely unfamiliar and entirely recognizable at the same time. Around him, conversations continued. People discussed market trends and legal strategy. Someone complimented the article. Another mentioned her company's remarkable growth. Ethan heard every word and none of them, because suddenly he remembered the woman sitting on the floor of their first apartment, assembling bookshelves by hand. The woman who believed every problem could be solved with patience and effort. The woman whose dreams he once dismissed as unrealistic. An uncomfortable realization settled over him. He had never truly seen her. Not completely. He had measured her value according to the role she played in his life rather than the person she actually was. Weeks later, both Claire and Ethan received invitations to the same event, the Innovators Leadership Gala in New York City, one of the country's most prestigious gatherings for entrepreneurs, investors, and business leaders. Ethan attended because networking was expected. Claire attended because she had been selected for a special recognition award. Neither knew the other would be there. And now, standing beneath the chandeliers of the Grand Regent Hotel, 6 years after the divorce, they occupied the same room once again. The countdown above the stage continued. 40 seconds. 39. 38. Guests gradually moved toward their seats. Anticipation rippled through the ballroom. Claire folded her hands together and released a slow breath. Nearby, executives discussed market forecasts. Journalists adjusted camera equipment. Event staff prepared final details. Everything felt strangely calm. Across the room, Ethan could not stop watching her. Not because he wanted her back. The emotion was more complicated than that. Regret rarely announces itself loudly. Sometimes it arrives quietly, like a realization years too late. The lights dimmed further. A spotlight illuminated the stage. The master of ceremonies stepped forward as applause swept through the ballroom. 20 seconds. 19. 18. Claire felt her heartbeat quicken. Not from nervousness, from gratitude. She thought about the tiny apartment in Brooklyn, the rejections, the sleepless nights, the students whose success mattered more than headlines. Every difficult step had led here. 10 seconds. 9. 8. The massive screens surrounding the ballroom flickered to life. Ethan's attention shifted toward them. Around him, hundreds of guests looked forward expectantly. 5. 4. 3. 2. 1. The room fell silent as the first image appeared on the giant screens. And the moment Ethan Walker had never imagined was finally about to begin. The first image filled every screen in the ballroom at once. A professional portrait of Claire Bennett standing inside a bright classroom surrounded by students. The photograph was simple. No extravagant jewelry. No dramatic pose. Just a woman smiling beside the people she had dedicated her company to serving. Beneath the image appeared a single sentence. Transforming educational access for more than 2 million students nationwide. A quiet murmur spread across the audience. Then another image appeared. Charts. Growth statistics. Headlines from major publications. Partnerships with school districts across all 50 states. The numbers were impressive, but it was the impact behind them that captured the room's attention. Claire watched silently from her place near the stage. She had seen the presentation before. The event organizers had requested approval weeks earlier. Yet seeing her journey displayed before hundreds of influential leaders felt strangely surreal. It was like watching someone else's life unfold across the screens. The master of ceremonies stepped forward with a smile. "Tonight we celebrate innovation that changes lives," he said. "Not only business success, but meaningful impact." Applause echoed through the ballroom. Ethan remained seated, unable to look away. Around him, people nodded in admiration as they watched the presentation continue. Every achievement seemed to widen the distance between the woman he once knew and the woman standing here tonight. He remembered the countless evenings Claire spent reading educational research at their kitchen table. Back then, he had considered it a hobby, an interest, something admirable but ultimately impractical. He had never imagined she would build an entire movement from it. The realization settled heavily in his chest. It was not envy. Claire's success did not diminish his own. It was something more difficult. The recognition that he had completely underestimated someone who deserved far more credit than he ever gave her. The presentation shifted to a short video montage. Teachers described how Claire's platform helped struggling students. Parents spoke about opportunities their children never thought possible. Graduates shared stories of scholarships, internships, and careers that began because someone finally believed in them. As the testimonials played, many guests grew visibly emotional. One woman near the front dabbed at her eyes. A venture capitalist who rarely showed emotion sat forward in his chair. Even seasoned executives seemed affected by the authenticity of the stories. Because unlike many success narratives built around wealth or status, Claire's story was rooted in service. She had not created a luxury brand. She had not built an empire focused solely on profit. She had built pathways for people who needed them most. When the video ended, the room fell briefly silent. Then the applause began. At first it was polite, respectful, but within seconds it grew louder, stronger. Guests rose from their seats one after another. The sound filled every corner of the ballroom. A standing ovation. Claire felt warmth rush to her face. For a moment she looked down, overwhelmed. Not by the recognition itself, by what it represented. 6 years earlier, she had sat alone on the floor of a nearly empty apartment wondering whether she would ever rebuild her life. Now hundreds of people were standing not because she had become famous, but because her work mattered. Across the room, Ethan slowly rose as well. The applause surrounded him, yet he barely heard it. His attention remained fixed on Claire. Not the successful entrepreneur, not the public figure. Simply Claire, the woman whose potential had existed all along. The woman he failed to understand. The master of ceremonies raised a hand as the applause gradually softened. "There is one more reason we are honoring Claire Bennett tonight," he said. The screens behind him changed once more. A familiar image appeared. The cover of Forbes magazine. Claire's face stared confidently from the page. The audience erupted again. Some guests laughed in delighted surprise. Others immediately reached for their phones. Cameras flashed throughout the ballroom. Ethan stared at the image. He had seen the cover before, of course. Everyone in business circles had. But seeing it displayed here, surrounded by the full story of her journey, carried a different weight. Because now he understood what the cover actually represented. It was never about fame. It was evidence. Proof of resilience. Proof that rejection does not determine destiny. Proof that someone else's limited vision should never become your permanent reality. The master of ceremonies smiled toward the stage entrance. "Please join me in welcoming this year's Innovator of Impact Award recipient, Claire Bennett." The spotlight found her immediately. The ballroom erupted once more. Claire took a slow breath and began walking toward the stage. Her sapphire blue gown caught the soft golden light as she moved through the crowd. People reached out to shake her hand. Others congratulated her as she passed. She thanked them with quiet sincerity. No grand gestures. No performance. Just gratitude. As she approached the stage, her eyes briefly swept across the audience. For a fraction of a second, they met Ethan's. Neither smiled. Neither looked away immediately. The moment was calm, respectful, unexpectedly peaceful. There was no anger left between them. No desire for confrontation. Only the undeniable truth of everything that had happened since their lives diverged. Then Claire continued walking. She climbed the steps and accepted the award from the master of ceremonies. The crystal surface reflected the ballroom lights like scattered stars. The applause continued for several more seconds before finally settling into silence. Claire stepped toward the microphone. Hundreds of people waited to hear what she would say. And somewhere near the center of the room, Ethan Walker found himself listening more carefully than anyone. Claire rested both hands lightly on the sides of the podium and looked out across the ballroom. The spotlight was bright, but not bright enough to hide the faces staring back at her. Investors, founders, journalists, educators, people who represented industries worth billions of dollars. Yet the faces that caught her attention were not the powerful ones. They were the teachers seated near the front, the nonprofit leaders, the school administrators who had spent years fighting impossible battles with limited resources. They were the people who understood exactly why she had started this journey. The applause slowly faded. Silence settled across the room. Claire smiled softly before speaking. "Thank you." Her voice carried through the ballroom with calm confidence. "When I started this company, I was not trying to build something impressive. I was trying to solve a problem." The room listened. There are talented students in every city, every town, and every neighborhood in America. But talent alone is not always enough. Opportunity matters. Access matters. Encouragement matters. Several heads nodded. Claire glanced briefly at the crystal award in her hands before continuing. "For a long time, I thought success meant proving something. Proving that I belonged. Proving that I was capable. Proving that I deserved a seat at certain tables." A faint laugh moved through the audience. Many understood exactly what she meant. But somewhere along the way, I learned something better. The goal is not to prove your value. The goal is to recognize it before anyone else does. The ballroom grew even quieter. Ethan felt those words settle heavily inside him, because he realized they were not simply business advice. They were the lesson Claire had spent years learning the hard way. The lesson he had never helped her discover. Claire continued. "There were moments when people told me my ideas were unrealistic. There were moments when people thought I should aim lower. Stay safer. Be more practical." A few knowing smiles appeared around the room. Every entrepreneur recognized that experience. And to be fair, some days they may have been right. There were days I had no idea what I was doing. Laughter spread gently across the audience. Claire laughed too. There were days I questioned myself more than anyone else ever could. The honesty resonated immediately. She was not standing there pretending the journey had been effortless. She was telling the truth, and the truth was always more powerful. But every time I considered quitting, I remembered the students. I remembered why I started. Purpose has a way of carrying you farther than confidence ever can. Applause broke out briefly before settling again. Claire paused, taking in the room. For the first time that evening, she felt completely at peace. Not because she had achieved some final destination. Success rarely worked that way. There was always another challenge waiting. Another goal. Another responsibility. The peace came from knowing she no longer needed anyone's permission to believe in herself. "This award belongs to my team," she said. "It belongs to every teacher who gave our platform a chance. It belongs to every student who trusted that their future could be bigger than their circumstances." Her voice softened slightly. "And it belongs to anyone who has ever been underestimated." A ripple moved through the audience. Not dramatic. Not obvious. Just enough to signal that many people felt personally seen. Claire smiled. "Sometimes the people around us only see who we are today. They do not see who we could become tomorrow." Ethan lowered his eyes for a moment. The sentence landed harder than he expected, because he knew exactly how true it was. Years ago, he had looked at Claire and seen limitations. He had mistaken quietness for weakness, stability for lack of ambition, patience for lack of vision. He understood now how wrong he had been. Not because she had become successful, because the qualities he once dismissed were the exact qualities that built her success. The speech ended moments later to another standing ovation. This time the applause lasted even longer. Claire thanked the audience and stepped away from the podium. The ceremony continued, but many conversations immediately shifted toward her. Reporters requested interviews. Executives wanted introductions. Investors lined up hoping for a few minutes of her attention. Yet despite the growing crowd around her, Claire remained exactly the same. Warm, gracious, present. She spoke with a young teacher from Ohio as attentively as she spoke with a billionaire philanthropist. She listened more than she talked. She asked questions. She thanked people sincerely. Across the ballroom, Ethan watched quietly. His fiancée, Rebecca, noticed the expression on his face. "You seem lost in thought," she said gently. Ethan looked toward the stage where Claire continued greeting guests. "I think I spent a long time misunderstanding someone." Rebecca followed his gaze. She studied Claire for a moment before smiling softly. "It happens more often than people admit." Ethan nodded, but he knew this was different. Some misunderstandings cost opportunities. Others cost relationships. The evening continued. Dinner was served beneath crystal chandeliers. Conversations flowed. Music played softly in the background. Eventually, guests began moving toward networking receptions throughout the hotel. Claire finally found a quiet corner near a floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the city. For the first time all evening, she was alone. The skyline stretched endlessly before her. Thousands of lights glittered beneath the night sky. She remembered the version of herself who once sat alone in that small Brooklyn apartment, staring at uncertainty. If she could speak to that woman now, she would not tell her about awards or magazine covers. She would not mention recognition or success. She would simply tell her to keep going, because everything she was searching for had been inside her all along. Behind her, footsteps approached slowly. Familiar footsteps. Claire turned slightly as Ethan Walker stopped a few feet away. For the first time in 6 years, neither of them had anywhere else to be. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Beyond the glass, Manhattan glittered beneath the night sky like a field of scattered diamonds. Ferries traced slow paths across the dark Hudson River. Headlights flowed through the streets far below. The city continued moving, unaware of the quiet reckoning taking place beside a ballroom window. Ethan slipped his hands into his pockets and offered a small, uncertain smile. "Congratulations, Claire." The words were simple, genuine. Claire studied him for a moment before returning the smile. "Thank you, Ethan." There was no tension in her voice. No bitterness. Just calm. The kind of calm that only arrives after years of healing. Ethan glanced toward the ballroom where guests continued celebrating. "You were incredible up there." Claire laughed softly. "I was terrified." "You hit it well." "Years of practice pretending I knew what I was doing." The joke landed easily between them. To Ethan's surprise, the conversation felt natural. Familiar without being intimate. Comfortable without reopening old wounds. For several seconds they stood side by side looking out at the city. Then Ethan exhaled slowly. "I owe you an apology." Claire remained quiet. He continued. "Actually, I owe you several." His gaze lowered briefly toward the floor. "I spent years thinking I understood people. I built an entire career around evaluating situations, identifying potential, making judgments. I thought I was good at it." A faint smile crossed his face. "Turns out I was not nearly as good as I believed." Claire listened without interrupting. Ethan shook his head lightly. "I saw your success tonight and realized something. None of this happened suddenly. You were always capable of it. I just never saw it." The words hung gently in the air. They were not dramatic. They did not need to be, because sincerity carried its own weight. Claire looked back toward the skyline. For years she had imagined this conversation. Sometimes she imagined anger. Sometimes vindication. Sometimes a perfectly crafted response that would make Ethan regret everything he had ever said. Yet now that the moment had arrived, none of those things seemed important. "We were different people back then," she said quietly. Ethan nodded. "Maybe, but I still said things I should not have said." Claire could hear the regret in his voice. Real regret. Not performative. Not self-serving. The kind that comes from honest reflection. "I know," she answered gently. Another silence settled between them. Comfortable this time. Not empty. Ethan glanced toward her. "Can I ask you something?" Claire nodded. "Did you ever hate me?" The question surprised her. She thought carefully before answering. "For a while, I thought I did." Ethan accepted that without protest. "But eventually I realized I was carrying too much of my future in my anger." She smiled faintly. It was heavy. Ethan laughed quietly. "That sounds like something you would say." Claire laughed too. "Probably." The city lights reflected softly against the glass. Somewhere behind them, music drifted from the ballroom. The evening was beginning to wind down. Guests were leaving. Conversations were growing smaller. More personal. Ethan looked thoughtful. "You know what I remember most?" Claire raised an eyebrow. "What?" "The notebooks." She looked confused. "What notebooks?" "The ones you always carried around." His smile widened. "You were constantly writing ideas down. Business ideas. Education ideas. Community programs. Random inventions. Half the time I had no idea what you were talking about." Claire laughed. "Most of those ideas were terrible." "Maybe." Ethan shrugged. "But looking back, I think that was the point. You were always building something in your head." He looked at her with quiet admiration. "I should have paid more attention." Claire felt an unexpected warmth at the comment. Not because she needed his validation anymore, but because it was honest. For years, she had felt invisible inside her own marriage. Not intentionally, perhaps, but invisibly all the same. Hearing someone finally acknowledge who she had been felt strangely healing. Ethan glanced toward the ballroom entrance where Rebecca waited patiently across the room. She gave him an encouraging smile before returning to her conversation. Claire noticed and smiled. She seems wonderful. Ethan followed her gaze. She is. There was affection in his voice. Stable, mature, healthy. Claire was genuinely happy to hear it. Life had moved forward for both of them. As it should. Ethan looked back at Claire one final time. I am proud of you. The words landed differently than the congratulations she had received all evening, because these came from someone who understood exactly how far she had traveled. Claire smiled softly. Thank you. Ethan nodded once. Then he stepped back. Take care of yourself, Claire. You too, Ethan. He turned and walked toward the ballroom. Claire watched him go for a moment before returning her attention to the city beyond the glass. The strange thing was that she felt no triumph, no satisfaction at proving anyone wrong, only peace, because the chapter she spent years trying to rewrite no longer needed editing. It had already become part of a much larger story, and for the first time, she understood that success was never about showing someone what they lost. It was about finally seeing yourself clearly enough to stop asking for permission to shine. The gala finally ended shortly after midnight. One by one, the guests drifted toward elevators, waiting cars, and flights scheduled for the following morning. The energy that had filled the Grand Regent Hotel slowly dissolved into the quiet efficiency of staff clearing tables and folding away signs. Claire remained by the window a few minutes longer after Ethan left. The city stretched endlessly before her, glowing beneath the autumn sky. For years she had imagined success as a destination, a finish line somewhere beyond struggle. Yet standing here now, she realized success felt far less dramatic than she once expected. It felt peaceful. The next morning, sunlight spilled across the hardwood floors of her Manhattan apartment. Claire woke before her alarm, a habit she had never managed to break. She padded into the kitchen, brewed coffee, and opened her laptop. More than 400 emails waited in her inbox. Congratulations. Interview requests. Partnership opportunities. Invitations to conferences and speaking engagements. She scanned through them patiently. The attention was flattering, but her focus remained unchanged. At 9 o'clock sharp, she joined a video call with her executive team. The faces that appeared on screen represented years of shared effort. Olivia from operations, Marcus from product development, Jennifer from school partnerships. People who had worked through uncertainty, setbacks, and impossible deadlines. Congratulations, boss, Marcus said with a grin. Several others applauded. Claire laughed. You all realize this means people will expect even more from us now. Groans filled the call. Then laughter. The familiar rhythm settled in immediately. Budgets, product updates, expansion plans, student engagement reports. The work continued. It always did. After the meeting ended, Claire reviewed a report from a rural district in Montana. Student participation rates had increased nearly 40% since adopting their platform. She smiled. These numbers mattered more to her than awards ever could. They represented real people, real futures, real possibilities. Later that afternoon, Claire visited one of the schools participating in a new mentorship initiative. The building sat on the edge of Newark, New Jersey, surrounded by brick row houses and busy streets. As she entered the school gymnasium, dozens of students gathered for a leadership workshop. Most had no idea who she was, and Claire preferred it that way. She spent the afternoon answering questions about careers, education, and perseverance. One student, a 17-year-old named Daniel, lingered after the session ended. He looked nervous. Can I ask you something? He said. Of course. He shifted his backpack higher onto his shoulder. Did you always know you would be successful? Claire smiled. The question reminded her of a younger version of herself. Not even a little. Daniel looked surprised. Really? Really? She leaned against a nearby table. Most people think confidence comes first. It usually does not. Most of the time you start moving before you feel ready. He considered that quietly. So how do you know if you are making the right decision? Claire looked around the nearly empty gymnasium. Folding chairs lined the walls. Afternoon sunlight streamed through high windows. Sometimes you do not know, she admitted. You just keep taking the next right step. Daniel nodded slowly. Before leaving, he thanked her and hurried toward the parking lot where his mother waited outside. Claire watched him go and felt a familiar sense of purpose. This was why she started. Not magazine covers. Not recognition. Moments like this. That evening, as she returned home, a package waited outside her apartment door. Curious, she carried it inside. The box was small and carefully wrapped. There was no return address. Inside, she found a leather-bound notebook. Elegant, understated, the kind of notebook designed to last decades. Tucked inside the cover was a handwritten card. Claire recognized the handwriting immediately. It belonged to Ethan. The note was brief. You once filled notebooks with ideas. The world is better because you never stopped. Congratulations, Claire. Keep building. Ethan. Claire stared at the message for several seconds. Then she smiled. There was no hidden meaning. No attempt to revisit the past. Just respect. Just closure. She placed the card back inside the notebook and carried it to her desk. Outside her apartment windows, Manhattan glowed beneath the evening sky. Claire opened the first page. The paper was blank. Fresh. Full of possibility. She picked up a pen and began writing. Because despite everything that had happened, despite every achievement, every obstacle, every unexpected turn, she knew one simple truth. The most important chapter of her story had never been the one she survived. It was the one she was still creating. 3 months passed faster than Claire expected. Winter arrived in New York with sharp winds that swept through the avenues and dusted rooftops with thin layers of snow. The city seemed quieter beneath gray skies, yet her world had never been busier. The notebook Ethan had given her now rested on the corner of her desk, its pages gradually filling with sketches, ideas, goals, and questions. Some mornings she opened it before sunrise while the city still slept. Other mornings she scribbled notes between meetings, flights, and conference calls. The notebook had become a reminder that growth never truly ended. One December afternoon, Claire found herself standing inside a renovated community center in Detroit. Children hurried through hallways decorated with colorful murals. Volunteers arranged laptops across folding tables. Teachers prepared workshops focused on career readiness and technology training. Her company had recently partnered with local organizations to create learning hubs in underserved neighborhoods, and this location was among the first. As she toured the facility, she noticed a young girl sitting alone near the back of a classroom. Unlike the others, she was not participating in the activities. She sat quietly, staring at a blank computer screen. Claire approached carefully and took a seat beside her. "Having fun?" she asked gently. The girl shrugged. "Not really." Claire smiled. "Fair enough. What is your name?" "Sophie." "Nice to meet you, Sophie." The girl glanced at her suspiciously. "Are you one of the teachers?" Claire laughed softly. "Not exactly." Sophie folded her arms. "Then why are you here?" The question caught Claire off guard. She thought for a moment before answering. "Because I care about what happens in places like this." Sophie looked unconvinced. "Why?" Outside the classroom windows, snowflakes drifted lazily through the air. The sounds of laughter echoed faintly from another room. Claire studied the young girl and suddenly saw a reflection of herself many years ago. Unsure, skeptical, waiting for evidence that dreams were worth believing in. "Because someone once helped me when I needed it," Claire replied. Sophie glanced down at the keyboard. "What if nobody helps me?" Claire leaned back in her chair. "Then you start by helping yourself. One step at a time." Sophie remained silent. "And sometimes," Claire continued, "you discover that people are willing to help after all. They just have to see you keep showing up." The girl considered this carefully. Finally, she nodded. It was a small gesture, but Claire recognized its importance. Confidence rarely appeared all at once. More often, it arrived quietly. A decision, a possibility, a willingness to try. Later that evening, as Claire boarded a flight back to New York, she found herself thinking about Sophie. There had been a time when Claire believed success would eventually eliminate uncertainty. Instead, success had simply changed its shape. New challenges appeared, new responsibilities, new expectations. Yet she welcomed them, because unlike fear, purpose gave uncertainty meaning. Back in Manhattan, another surprise waited. Her assistant informed her that a national foundation wanted to fund a major expansion project. The initiative would bring educational resources to hundreds of additional communities over the next 5 years. The proposal was ambitious, expensive, complex, exactly the sort of challenge that once would have terrified her. Now it excited her. That evening she remained at the office long after most employees had gone home. The city lights reflected against the glass walls surrounding her conference room. Documents covered the table. Budgets, projections, strategic plans. Claire stood near the window and looked out across the skyline. Years ago, she would have questioned whether she belonged in rooms like this, whether she was qualified enough, smart enough, experienced enough. Now she understood something important. Nobody arrived fully prepared for the future. Growth happened because people accepted opportunities before they felt completely ready. Her phone buzzed softly. A message appeared from an unknown number. Curious, she opened it. Attached was a photograph. It showed a young woman standing outside an engineering building at a university campus. Beneath the picture was a short note. Hi Claire, this is Madison. You helped me get into engineering school years ago. Today I accepted my first internship at a robotics company. Thank you for believing in me before I believed in myself. Claire stared at the message. Then she smiled. Not because of recognition, not because of gratitude, because moments like this reminded her that success multiplied when it was shared. She saved the photo and slipped her phone back into her pocket. Outside, snow continued falling across the city. The future remained unwritten. Challenges still waited beyond the horizon. But for the first time in her life, Claire was not afraid of what came next, because she had already learned the lesson that mattered most. The opinions that once defined her no longer held power. The doubts that once limited her no longer set the boundaries of her world. And somewhere between heartbreak and hope, between uncertainty and belief, she had discovered something stronger than validation. She had discovered herself. Spring arrived gradually, painting New York City in softer colors. The sharp edge of winter disappeared from the air. Trees in Bryant Park began showing hints of green. Outdoor cafes filled with conversation. The city seemed to breathe a little easier. Claire noticed the change during one of the rare mornings she allowed herself to walk to work. She carried a coffee in one hand and her notebook in the other, moving through streets that no longer felt intimidating. Years ago, Manhattan had seemed enormous, a city filled with people who knew exactly where they were going. Now she understood that most people were simply figuring things out one day at a time. Her company continued expanding at a pace that sometimes felt unreal. New partnerships launched across multiple states. Educational leaders requested meetings months in advance. National organizations invited her to advisory boards and strategic initiatives. Yet despite the growing attention, Claire protected certain rituals. She still reviewed student stories personally. She still visited schools whenever possible. And every Friday afternoon, she blocked 1 hour on her calendar for thinking. No meetings, no phone calls, no interruptions, just space to reflect. On one particular Friday, she sat alone in her office overlooking the city. Sunlight poured through the glass walls, illuminating the notebook that had become a constant companion. She flipped through older pages, business ideas, expansion plans, personal reflections, goals she had already achieved, dreams she had not yet pursued. Then she stopped on a page dated nearly 2 years earlier. At the top, written in careful handwriting, was a simple question. What would I do if I stopped being afraid? Claire stared at the words. She remembered writing them during a difficult period when growth felt uncertain and failure seemed possible. Back then, fear had still occupied more space in her life than she wanted to admit. She smiled gently, not because fear had disappeared, because it no longer controlled her decisions. Her phone buzzed softly. A calendar reminder appeared. Mentorship luncheon. Claire closed the notebook and headed downstairs. The event took place inside a renovated warehouse in Brooklyn that had been transformed into an innovation center for young entrepreneurs. More than 100 students and early-stage founders filled the room. The energy was contagious. Ideas bounced between tables. Conversations overlapped. Possibility seemed to hum in the air like electricity. Claire spent the afternoon answering questions and listening to stories. One young founder described a healthcare application she was building. Another explained a nonprofit designed to support first-generation college students. Their passion reminded Claire of something important. Every success story begins as an idea nobody can fully see yet. Near the end of the event, a young woman approached her nervously. She looked to be in her early 20s. I just wanted to thank you, she said. For what? Claire asked. For being visible. The answer surprised her. The young woman smiled awkwardly. Sometimes when people talk about success, it feels impossible, like it belongs to someone else. But your story feels different. Claire listened carefully. Different how? The young woman thought for a moment. Because you seem real. The comment stayed with Claire long after the event ended. Real. For years she had worried about not being enough. Not impressive enough. Not accomplished enough. Not extraordinary enough. Yet perhaps authenticity mattered more than perfection ever could. That evening she returned home and found herself thinking about all the versions of herself that had existed along the way. The young woman who believed marriage would solve uncertainty. The newly divorced woman staring at an empty apartment. The exhausted entrepreneur working multiple jobs. The founder facing rejection after rejection. None of those versions were mistakes. They were steps. Necessary chapters. Necessary lessons. As dusk settled across the city, Claire stepped onto her balcony. The skyline glowed beneath a lavender sky. Ferries crossed the river. Lights flickered on inside distant apartment buildings. Millions of lives unfolding simultaneously. She wondered how many people were standing at their own crossroads tonight. How many were questioning themselves, doubting themselves, waiting for proof that they were capable of more. The truth, she realized, was that proof rarely arrives first. Belief comes before evidence. Courage comes before certainty. Growth comes before confidence. Her phone vibrated again. Another message. This time from Sophie, the young girl she had met months earlier in Detroit. A photograph appeared on the screen. Sophie stood beside a science fair project, smiling proudly. Beneath the picture was a short note. I won first place. Thank you for telling me to keep showing up. Claire stared at the image as a smile slowly spread across her face. Then she looked out across the city once more. Somewhere beyond the lights and buildings, thousands of stories were still being written. Some were just beginning. Some were rebuilding after loss. Some were waiting for a single reason to believe in tomorrow. And Claire understood now that the most powerful thing a person could do was not simply succeed. It was to become living proof that a different future was possible. By early summer, Claire's calendar looked impossible. Flights crossed the country weekly. Conferences filled weekends. Strategic meetings consumed afternoons. Yet she remained committed to one principle that had guided her from the beginning. Never become so busy building opportunities that you stop paying attention to the people those opportunities are meant to serve. That principle brought her to San Diego on a bright June morning. The annual National Education Futures Summit had drawn thousands of educators, policymakers, researchers, and business leaders from across the country. The convention center overlooked the harbor, where sailboats drifted across blue water beneath a cloudless sky. Palm trees swayed in the warm breeze. The atmosphere felt optimistic, hopeful, the kind of place where people gathered not simply to discuss problems, but to imagine solutions. Claire was scheduled to deliver the keynote address on the final day of the conference. The event organizers expected a large audience. Media outlets planned coverage. Industry leaders wanted meetings. Yet as she walked through the exhibition hall before her presentation, it was not the executives who caught her attention. It was a group of high school students standing beside a display booth showcasing innovative learning projects. Their excitement reminded her why she had entered this field in the first place. One student explained a community garden initiative designed to teach sustainability. Another demonstrated a coding project created entirely by teenagers. Their enthusiasm was contagious. Claire spent nearly an hour speaking with them. By the time she reached the main auditorium, she felt energized rather than exhausted. More than 3,000 people filled the room. Giant screens framed the stage. Spotlights illuminated rows of seats stretching toward the back wall. The low hum of conversation echoed through the space. As Claire waited backstage, she reviewed a few notes in her notebook. Not a speech, just reminders. Listen, be honest. Remember why this matters. The moderator introduced her with a long list of accomplishments. Founder, innovator, industry leader, visionary. The audience applauded warmly as she stepped onto the stage. Claire smiled, thanked the moderator, and approached the microphone. For a moment, she simply looked out across the crowd. Thousands of faces stared back. Teachers, students, principals, entrepreneurs, people from every corner of the country. When people talk about education, she began, they usually talk about systems. The room quieted immediately. Policies, budgets, programs, data. She paused. Those things matter. But education has always been about people. Heads nodded throughout the audience. Claire continued. She spoke about opportunity, about resilience, about students who achieved extraordinary things after someone believed in them. She shared stories collected over years of traveling to schools across America, Stories about determination, creativity, potential. Nothing in her presentation focused on herself. Instead, she used her platform to highlight others. Teachers who worked tirelessly, families who sacrificed, young people who refused to let circumstances define their futures. By the end of the speech, the audience rose to its feet. The applause lasted nearly a minute. Yet what stayed with Claire was not the ovation. It was something that happened afterward. As attendees exited the auditorium, a woman approached her carrying a worn leather tote bag. She appeared to be in her late 50s. Her expression was thoughtful. "I wanted to thank you," the woman said. Claire smiled. "That is very kind." The woman shook her head. "Not for the speech." Claire looked curious. "Then for what?" The woman hesitated before answering. "For changing what success looks like." Claire remained silent. The woman continued. "For a long time, people believed success meant becoming powerful, wealthy, important." Her eyes softened. "You remind people that success can also mean helping others become those things." The comment lingered long after the conversation ended. That evening, Claire sat alone on a bench overlooking the harbor. The sun slowly disappeared beneath the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Boats drifted across the water. Seagulls circled overhead. The air smelled faintly of salt and summer. She opened her notebook and turned to a blank page. For several minutes, she simply watched the sunset. Then she wrote a single sentence. "The greatest achievement is not what you build for yourself. It is what continues growing because you believed in someone else." Claire closed the notebook and looked toward the fading light. Years ago, she thought she was rebuilding her life. What she understood now was far more beautiful. She had not simply rebuilt. She had become the kind of person she once needed herself. The months that followed brought a quieter kind of growth. The headlines became less frequent. The interviews became more selective. Public attention moved on to newer stories, newer companies, newer faces. Claire welcomed the change. Fame had never been the destination. Impact was. On a crisp September morning, she arrived at the headquarters of her organization before most of the staff. The building buzzed with potential even in its silence. Sunlight spilled across polished floors. Computer screens rested dark and waiting. Coffee machines had not yet begun their daily chorus. Claire carried her notebook into a conference room overlooking the city and settled into her usual seat near the window. Over the years, she had learned that leadership often required stillness before action, a chance to think before deciding where energy should go next. On the table sat a proposal unlike any she had reviewed before. A coalition of education groups wanted to partner with her organization to launch a nationwide initiative focused on underserved communities. If approved, the project could reach millions of additional students over the next decade. The numbers were staggering. The logistics were complicated. The responsibility was enormous. Yet as Claire studied the documents, she felt something familiar. Not fear. Purpose. The same feeling she experienced years ago while sketching ideas alone in a small apartment. The scale had changed. The mission had not. Later that afternoon, senior leaders gathered to discuss the proposal. Opinions varied. Some worried about the risks. Others focused on the opportunities. Charts appeared on screens. Forecasts filled whiteboards. Questions multiplied. Through it all, Claire listened carefully. She asked thoughtful questions. She challenged assumptions. She encouraged debate. By the end of the meeting, a clear direction emerged. They would move forward, not because success was guaranteed, because the potential impact justified the effort. As the team celebrated the decision, Claire quietly stepped away and returned to her office. Through the glass walls, she watched employees moving through hallways, collaborating in meeting spaces, solving problems together. Many of them had joined when the company consisted of only a handful of people. Others were newer, younger, bringing fresh perspectives and new ideas. Looking around, Claire realized something remarkable. The organization no longer depended entirely on her. It had become larger than any one person, larger than her story, larger than her name. And that was exactly what she had hoped for. That evening, she attended a small gathering hosted by a nonprofit partner in Brooklyn. There were no cameras, no reporters, no major sponsors, just educators, volunteers, students, and families sharing stories about progress and possibility. During the event, a mother approached Claire holding the hand of a young boy. "I wanted you to meet someone," she said. The boy looked shy. "This is Michael." Claire knelt slightly to meet him at eye level. Nice to meet you, Michael. The boy smiled. My teacher says I am really good at science. Claire smiled back. That sounds like a very smart teacher. The mother laughed softly. Then her expression grew more serious. Before your program came to our district, he struggled. He felt invisible. Her eyes glistened slightly. Now he talks about becoming an engineer. Claire glanced at the boy. His face brightened immediately at the word. Engineer. Such a simple dream. Such a powerful one. For several minutes they talked about school, science experiments, and favorite subjects. Nothing extraordinary. Yet as Claire listened, she felt a familiar certainty settle inside her. This was the true measure of success. Not awards. Not magazine covers. Not recognition. Lives changing quietly where most people would never look. Later that night, she walked through Brooklyn beneath a sky scattered with stars. The air carried the first hints of autumn. Leaves drifted along sidewalks. Restaurant windows glowed warmly against the darkness. Somewhere in the distance, a train rolled across elevated tracks. The city felt alive in that uniquely New York way, moving constantly, evolving constantly. Claire thought about the many versions of herself that had existed along this journey. The woman who once doubted her worth. The woman who rebuilt from uncertainty. The woman who discovered strength she never knew she possessed. None of them were gone. They had simply become part of who she was now. Her phone vibrated. Gently, a message appeared from her leadership team. The proposal had received preliminary approval. The initiative was officially moving forward. Claire smiled as she read the news. Then she slipped the phone back into her pocket and continued walking. The road ahead would not be easy. Important work rarely was. But for the first time in her life, she no longer measured progress by how far she had come from her past. She measured it by how many people she could help move toward a better future. And somewhere beyond the city lights, beyond the plans and projects still waiting to unfold, an even greater chapter was quietly beginning. 1 year later, the initiative exceeded every expectation. Communities that once struggled to access quality educational resources were now connected through programs, mentorship networks, and technology platforms reaching farther than anyone had originally imagined. Reports arrived from small towns in Montana, neighborhoods in Chicago, rural communities in Alabama, and school districts along the California coast. The numbers were impressive, but Claire had learned long ago that numbers only told part of the story. Behind every statistic was a student discovering confidence, a teacher finding support, a family seeing possibilities where obstacles once stood. On a bright October morning, Claire traveled to Washington, District of Columbia, for a national summit focused on education and economic mobility. Leaders from across the country gathered inside a historic building just blocks from the National Mall. Marble floors reflected sunlight streaming through tall windows. Conversations echoed beneath high ceilings. The atmosphere carried a sense of purpose that felt larger than any individual organization. Claire arrived quietly, carrying the same notebook that had followed her through years of transformation. She no longer felt intimidated by rooms filled with influential people. She had learned that titles and accomplishments mattered far less than character and commitment. During the opening session, speakers discussed policy, innovation, and long-term solutions. Yet the moment that stayed with Claire happened later that afternoon. A panel of students took the stage to share their experiences. One by one, they spoke about challenges they had faced and opportunities that changed the direction of their lives. Then a young woman stepped forward. Confident, poised, familiar. Claire immediately recognized her. Sophie, the quiet girl she had met years earlier in Detroit. The girl who once sat alone staring at a blank computer screen, uncertain whether anyone would help her. Sophie smiled at the audience before speaking. When I was younger, I thought successful people were different from everyone else, she said. I thought they were born with something special. The room listened attentively. Then I met someone who taught me something important. She told me that confidence does not always come first. Sometimes you keep showing up until confidence catches up with you. Claire felt her throat tighten unexpectedly. Sophie continued. She spoke about science competitions, college applications, internships, and dreams that once felt impossible. She spoke about learning to believe in herself. She spoke about discovering that potential is often hidden beneath fear. When the audience rose to applaud at the end of her remarks, Claire remained seated for a moment, overwhelmed by gratitude. Not because Sophie mentioned her, because Sophie no longer needed her. The young woman standing on that stage had become her own source of strength. Later that evening, a reception took place on a terrace overlooking the city. Autumn leaves drifted across walkways. The Washington Monument stood illuminated against the night sky. Guests mingled beneath strings of warm lights. Laughter and conversation floated through the cool air. Claire stood near the railing, watching the city glow in the distance. Sophie eventually found her. Neither said anything at first. They simply smiled. "You did not tell me you were speaking today," Claire said. Sophie laughed. "I wanted it to be a surprise." "You certainly accomplished that." They talked for nearly an hour. About college, future plans, new opportunities. As Claire listened, she realized something beautiful. The impact of a single encouraging conversation could travel farther than anyone imagined. Years earlier, she had spent a few minutes speaking to a discouraged teenager. Now that teenager was inspiring rooms full of people. The chain reaction continued. One life touching another. One act of belief creating another. As the evening drew to a close, Claire stepped away from the crowd and opened her notebook. The pages were nearly full now. Ideas, reflections, goals, memories. Evidence of a life rebuilt one decision at a time. She turned to the final blank page and paused. Then she wrote a single sentence. "The greatest victory is not becoming the person they said you never could be. It is helping others discover who they can become." Claire closed the notebook gently and looked out across the city lights. Years ago, she thought her story was about proving someone wrong. Now she understood it had never been about that at all. It was about becoming someone strong enough, wise enough, and generous enough to help others believe in possibilities they could not yet see for themselves. Several years later, on a quiet spring morning, Claire Bennett stood alone inside a newly opened learning center overlooking a river in St. Louis. The building was bright and welcoming, filled with classrooms, technology labs, mentorship spaces, and resources designed for students who once lacked access to opportunities. Sunlight streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, reflecting off polished wood floors. The scent of fresh paint still lingered faintly in the air. Staff members moved through the halls preparing for the center's official opening later that afternoon. But for a few precious minutes, the building belonged only to silence. Claire walked slowly through the empty corridors. On one wall hung photographs of students, teachers, volunteers, and community leaders whose lives had intersected with the mission she began years ago. Some faces she recognized immediately, others she had never met. Yet every image represented a story. Every story represented a possibility fulfilled. She paused before a framed photograph of Sophie standing beside a group of engineering students. Nearby was another picture of Madison presenting a robotics project. Further down the hall was Michael smiling proudly in front of a science fair display. Claire studied the images and felt a familiar warmth settle in her chest. None of those accomplishments belonged to her. They belonged to the people who earned them. She had simply helped open a door. Outside, the river shimmered beneath the morning sun. Boats drifted lazily across the water. The city slowly awakened. Claire moved toward the largest classroom and stepped inside. Rows of desks stood ready. Laptops rested neatly on tables. Whiteboards waited for ideas that had not yet been written. For a moment, she imagined the students who would soon fill the room. Some would arrive confident. Others would arrive uncertain. Some would carry dreams. Others would carry doubts. All of them would carry potential. She smiled, because potential had always been her favorite thing about people. It existed before achievement, before recognition, before proof. Potential was the quiet promise that tomorrow could become something greater than today. Her phone vibrated softly. A message appeared from her executive team. The organization had officially surpassed another major milestone. Millions of students reached. Thousands of schools supported. Countless mentorship connections established. The numbers were remarkable. Yet Claire simply smiled and slipped the phone back into her pocket. Years ago, she might have celebrated the statistics. Today, she cared more about the faces behind them. A few hours later, the center opened its doors. Families filled the hallways. Students explored classrooms. Teachers greeted one another with excitement. Community leaders delivered remarks. Laughter echoed through the building. Hope seemed present in every room. During the ceremony, a local journalist asked Claire a question she had answered many times before. "What does success mean to you now?" The younger version of Claire might have paused to think. This version already knew. She looked around the room before answering. At the students, at the parents, at the volunteers, at the future unfolding all around her. Success is watching someone else realize they are capable of more than they ever imagined. The journalist nodded thoughtfully, but Claire's attention had already shifted back to the crowd, because standing near the entrance was a young girl holding a notebook tightly against her chest. She looked nervous, curious, hopeful. Claire recognized that look instantly. It was the look of someone standing at the beginning of a journey. The girl hesitated before approaching. "Excuse me," she said softly. "Can I ask you something?" Claire smiled. "Of course." The girl glanced down at her notebook. "How did you know you could do all of this?" Claire looked at the notebook in the girl's hands and remembered her own. The sketches, the plans, the doubts, the dreams. Then she answered honestly, "I did not." The girl blinked. "You did not." Claire shook her head gently. "I just kept taking the next step." For a moment the girl considered the answer. Then she smiled. It was a small smile, but it carried the weight of possibility. After she walked away, Claire stood quietly in the middle of the room. Around her, conversations continued. New ideas were forming. New futures were beginning. And she realized that the most important thing she had built was never a company, a program, or a platform. It was belief. Belief that circumstances do not define destiny. Belief that setbacks are not endings. Belief that people can become far more than others expect of them. Years ago, someone told her what her future would be. They were wrong. Not because she proved them wrong. Because she stopped letting their opinion decide who she could become. And as sunlight filled the room and voices echoed with possibility, Claire understood the truth that had taken years to discover. Peace was never found in revenge. It was found in becoming the person she was always meant to be.